Yeah, was out, so I'll introduce myself. I've known myself all my life. I get along better now than I used to. So I'm Lance Waller. I'm in the Department of Biostatistics and Bioinformatics here in the School of Public Health. And I work with a lot of the PBE students, and I'm part of the training grant with YAP. And last year I did this part of this talk for the first time, and I've been interested in how we teach modeling for a long time, because it sort of seems like there's not really good introductory books to it. You all saw this during COVID. Everyone jumped in, but they jump halfway into the pool. They sort of assume you know what an SIR model is and you know what differential equations are, and they either wave it off and say, oh, there's a bunch of math, but if somebody wants to get into this, how do you work with data and how do you get it? So we had a lot of armchair modelers and a lot of interesting discussions from that. And I had taught the quantitative methods class for a while and had used this zombie example from a book chapter someone wrote kind of on a whim, and it sort of took off because people really had strong opinions about it. And I found some years people would really like it, some years people wouldn't like it. They were like, oh, I want to study real diseases. And I thought, what's the value of studying imaginary diseases, just to think about how we do modeling? Generally, when you're working on a particular disease setting, you're spending your time working on all the details of the model and not what are you doing in the first place. So besides it's October, I thought this would be more fun. It lets me use the chiller font. I don't use that one very often. And I've started a notebook because it seemed like this sort of literature should be hard copy. And I also found, what you find in the modeling is every once in a while, someone in their career goes, oh, let's do something fun. And they do some funny paper, then they get back to their serious stuff. So you've got this disconnected set of interesting models to illustrate points. And it also spinning off of that, there's a literature. So in 1974, there's a paper called The Unsuccessful Self-Treatment of a Case of Writer's Block. And it's blank. And they published it, and I thought, oh, that's really clever. And then there's a whole follow-up to that: unsuccessful treatments of writer block, a meta-analysis. Unsuccessful treatment of a case of writer's block, a replication through the lens of a budding entrepreneurship scholar concerned with originality, contribution, and rigor. And it's also blank, but then it has 6 pages of footnotes. Multidisciplinary replication of Upper's 1974 unsuccessful treatment of writer's block. It has multiple authors. That one's blank. Successful treatment of a case of writer's block, and they reference that one to show that they could get past it. And I found 10 or 12 of these. And now I'm trying to think, how can I write one? Or not write one, is the case maybe. But the rest of the notebook are some of the modeling papers. Some of them are really interesting and they're class projects and so on, and they're kind of designed to teach. Some of them sort of jump in and stay at the same level that I argue is a kind of hard place to start. So let's get started with this and see what we've got. The ghost is a red herring. I'm not going to do any ghost modeling. I'm sorry. I did read one, but it was by a physicist who said if they can walk through walls, they shouldn't be able to sit in chairs. So I thought, that's not one. Okay, so first of all, who am I kidding? I'm not getting funding for this. And the black and white picture is from my middle school yearbook. That's the Fantasy Wargaming Guild in 1979. We thought that was a cooler name than the Dungeons and Dragons Club. This is when Dungeons and Dragons was fresh. So this is me here with the hair. And then I did one of the zombie 5Ks where you run and they chase you, and you had like football flags, and you might think I'm cheating by covering up the flag here, but there's no cheating in an apocalypse. This is me with Thomas Bayes of Bayesian statistics, his tomb. Here's a map of the graveyard, a visitor's map. And so Bayes is right here. This is in London, outside of London, but it also has the sunken tomb. That's kind of cool. So how did I get here? I don't have a degree. I didn't get trained in mathematical modeling, although I was a math major at New Mexico State University. And in the fall of 1986, there was this new mathematical competition on modeling, and our math professor said, oh, you guys don't have any social life, you should do this. And it's kind of, you get 2 problems to choose from, and you spend a weekend coding stuff up. And we got an honorable mention, and it was the first time they did it. Our model was to manage a cobalt stockpile, which apparently is still a real problem, right? With all the laptop batteries. I grew up in Los Alamos, New Mexico, so after I graduated with my math degree, I worked as a research assistant there, and the person I was working with was kind of bored and hung out with the mathematical modeler. Since this is '87, they were modeling HIV. They were modeling the AIDS epidemic and the dynamics. And I thought, oh, that's really cool. And I started graduate school in operations research. And then I was studying statistics and taking a stochastic processes class. I was taking epidemiology in the veterinary school. And I took I was doing more and more statistics and epidemiology, but not really the differential equations. Although I did take a matrix population model class, like age distributions and stable, anyway, it was all, I thought it was interesting, but it was kind of a side interest. And then all my faculty positions have been in departments of biostatistics. So I've been more of a traditional statistician in public health, doing clinical trials and epi studies and environmental health mostly. And then when the modeling intersects with that is vaccine efficacy. So I was kind of interested at from the side, but when I moved to Emory, we started getting involved in those projects. The raccoon rabies project that Yop mentioned last week, got interested in disease ecology in the PPE program. We were looking at the space-time spread of this strain of rabies. And then I taught the quantitative methods class, which we did SIR models a lot, and now Yop and I are working with Mitchell on his dissertation using agent-based models in monarch butterfly migration. So I was interested in how do you do this? How do you interface the models with the data? So how do we learn modeling? We want to be answering questions, and it's really a pattern and process thing. We like the mathematical model because it describes a process and it generates observations and they have patterns in them, and we want to see if those patterns match the patterns we see in the real world. And we hope if those patterns match, then we might understand the process a little better. Although the connection between those is a little tricky. This is like one of the hard parts in ecology. Everything's connected and everything's moving at the same time. So you try to get more insight on it. So with the models, and you also are working with people in other disciplines. So you're coming in with the ecology perspective or the math perspective or the statistics perspective, but you want to get all those perspectives together. And so there's, how do we summarize what we know? How do we summarize what we want to know? How do we use models to find out the things we want to know? This is what we're trying to learn how to use them as tools, but I just feel, and maybe it's because I didn't take a curriculum that led me through this, that there's just not a lot of materials to get you started. I feel like you just get brought in, they show you one model and say, do another one, and it's kind of learning to swim by being in the pool, but I didn't get a lot of intuition on why I should do things. So what I'm trying to think through this is use applications in these thought experiments, what kind of problems I do, and that's where the imaginary stuff comes in, I think. So some of you have seen the whirling vortex of analysis, but we have questions we want to answer up on the left. We might think about what kind of data or observations would we need to answer the question? What data can we actually see? And then what questions can we answer with the data we see? And then how close is that to what we want? And we just keep going around, try to learn more each time around the cycle. So the process is what's really happening, and the pattern is the echoes of the process in your observed data. So for instance, the racial housing patterns in Atlanta are echoes of redlining practice. And so there was the official redlining, and then there's the implicit redlining of the way real estate agents show houses and the way people buy houses and stuff. But that pattern has a process behind it. And they're not uniquely connected in the sense that you might have more than one process that generates the same pattern. And sometimes, and this is kind of interesting to look at, is when you can see the same patterns from completely different processes. So you see a certain number of new cases in a week, is that because there's a lot of contact and there's not a big probability of transmission, or there wasn't much contact and there's a high probability of transmission? Unless you know what that contact rate is, you can't tell those two processes apart. So does the process need to be true in order to make the work interesting? I've taught students who said yes, and I've taught students who say no. I always thought if we did the imaginary one, then people wouldn't be so caught up in the minutia of the details. And, you know, people have very strong opinions about zombies, I found out. So there's two big classes of models when we talk about mathematical and computer modeling. There's the compartment models. Those are the susceptible, effective, recovered. where individuals move between these compartments or classes in the population. The parameters describe the transition rates, how fast that happens, and the SIR model is kind of the poster child for the compartmental models and variants of that. It's pretty amazing that that SIR model, which came around 1900 time period, is still a really useful tool. How many other analytic methods from 1900 do we use as regularly and treat them as like new things? Agent-based models, on the other hand, sort of brute force use computers to sit. It's like a Sims setup or a simulated population. You have agents that follow rules. So in Mitchell's case, he has virtual butterflies and they're trying to navigate to migrate. And we make relatively simple rules and then we turn them loose on the computer across, in his case, across a map that has all the landscape changes and water and elevation, and you see where they go. So you can watch for what the agent-based models or individual-based model people like to talk about as emergent behaviors. What emergent patterns come from this? And then you try to set the parameters on the simple rules to generate patterns that look like what the observations are. So the game of life was the first computer game, or one of the first ones that did this, and it used to be a screensaver where you had grids, and if you had two alive grids, then they would generate a child grid next to it. And you get these sort of random patterns all over. And then they have humans in the loop like World of Warcraft or other massive online games where people have avatars and they interact with each other. So there's the non-player characters that are the agents, and then you have people filling in, and you see what happens. You just watch what happens. Now, I don't know if there's anybody who's like really good at everything about modeling. You kind of come out to a different part. So the way we describe the models is we often draw those figures with the S, the I, the R, and the arrows and the betas. We ask you to do that in your qualifying exams a lot. Those figures tell us what equations to use. Some people just sit down and write down the equations. Not a lot of people, but some people do that, I'm sure. And then there's the people more like myself who like to spend time with the data or the states of the system. What can you observe? What did you simulate? And then what would that mean for this? So a lot of times you see the figures and the equations, but there's not a lot of discussion of the data. And the equations have parameters in them, and we want to know what those parameters are. How quickly do you transfer from susceptible to infected? And so I'm contrasting the states, which are things you could measure on your system if you could measure everything, like how many people are infected right now, how many people are susceptible. And then there's the parameters that are the values that drive changes in these. And the states might be something you can observe, or it might be something you could track in a perfect world, but we really don't see. Maybe we only get these weekly reports of numbers of cases or something. So an earlier book that talked about putting models and data together, well, one of the reasons I bring this up is there used to be the world of the modelers who would do the math, and there would be the data people who would use the data, and maybe a couple people in the middle, not a lot. Now there's a lot more overlap because both worlds are using Python and R, and they're kind of in the same software system, so they can fit ordinary differential equations, and they can fit regression models, and you can try different things. So there's more overlap now. This book came out in the 80s, and it said, it's like every model has assumptions, and every model is based on some story of something, but how do you confront, the phrase they used was confront your models with data. How can you decide whether your model's a good one? And if it is a good one, what are the parameter values? How infectious is it? What's R naught? Those sorts of things. Because a lot of the models we see in ecology are having biologically meaningful parameters, but we're not observing the data that let us estimate those. So the things you can estimate easily aren't really biologically interesting, and the things that are biologically interesting, we don't follow enough individuals around to know what's really happening, like how often do they interact. So those early HIV models were based on early other sexually transmitted disease like gonorrhea or syphilis, and that had random mixing models, like individuals would pair up at random, which is not what really happens, but the math is a lot easier. So then you solve the easy problem, then you try to tweak it, you go around the cycle again, try to make it more realistic, and then you start getting small world networks and some of those other ideas. And then my figure turned on its side. I don't know why that happened, but it did. So I had gone to some workshops where you had the modelers. It's like a junior high dance, right? You had the modelers on this side, and you had the statisticians on that side, like playing music, going, you mingle. And they would all talk about the other side, and the brave ones would walk out there. Do you want to write a paper together? Yeah, maybe. And then, oh, they said they might write a paper with me. I can't believe it. Where would we publish such a thing? So, or maybe I'm the only one that had that sort of experience in middle school. But you can see from the Dungeons and Dragons Club, I probably wasn't spending a lot of time out at the house parties. So anyway, one of the things we thought of in one of those workshops was the true model. This is nature's model. This is what's really going on. I would like to understand, and I can observe data from that. If I have a mathematical model, I can simulate data from that. I can say if my model's true, this is how the case is developed. And then I can see how close the generated data is to the observed data. And that's kind of a goodness of fit question. I've observed, I've expected, and there's chi-square tests, there's a statistical tool. So the modeler's worldview is kind of proposed model, generated data, observed data. Just zoom in there, maybe do a little bit of statistics. The statistician and epidemiology world was observed data. What associations do I see inside the data? And can I see what things vary together? It's probably some regression model, and it's probably not the way nature generates the data, but I just want to measure those associations and try to understand the system a little better. So the statisticians and epidemiologists live here, and the mathematical modelers live in this shape. No wonder they're on other sides of the dance floor and they don't know how to talk to each other, right? So one of the things we tried to do with the raccoon rabies was, well, if I get your simulated data and I treat it like I'm an epidemiologist and I start measuring associations, do I see the kind of associations that people have seen before? And that's, it's like doing the generated data, the observed data is seeing whether the patterns are the same. But looking at whether the associations and the patterns are the same is like a deeper pattern recognition. It still won't get you guaranteed to get you the right answer, but it's maybe treating the model like a data generating process and trying to understand it with the same tools. And it gives us a way to maybe connect to the data. So I've been advocating for that and trying to write papers about it. I don't have a huge following, but there's still hope. So you're familiar with this, the SIR model. A lot of us have seen this in class, but also through COVID and so on. You have susceptibles who get infected at a rate beta. The infecteds either move to recovered or removed at rate gamma. That's kind of the simple progress we have here. Everybody in the population is in one of these boxes at any given time. And then you have the rates of how you move. Now you can make it more detailed. Maybe the recovereds become susceptible after a while, like you get COVID and then a year later you could get it again. So you can move back, there's some rate you'd move back there so you can start tracking. You can have people move in, you can have people born, you can have people die from other reasons. So you can start to make it more complicated. Now that was the picture, and we often draw it that way. Then the picture motivates the set of differential equations. So if you assume that the population's fixed, there's n people, and so S plus I plus R has to equal n at any given time. And then I have random mixing of how people meet, and the number of S's who are randomly mixing around that bump into an I is S times I. It's just the way you could run into them in the time period. And then you have some probability of transmission, beta of them get infected. So I have the change in S over time. Is it goes down by the people who get infected. That's the I's and the S's that meet, the probability, and then I have it offset by the total, so I have a density dependent infection rate. And if I take them out of S, they have to go in somewhere. They're all going into I. So a lot of times when you can double check your work on these is anything you have that has a minus going out of S is probably going into I, unless I have a way to go directly to R. So really the equations look like someone's just making up stuff with math, but they're really keeping track of what happens from your picture. So your picture tells you where the pluses are, where the minuses are, and you can double check because like this is a closed system. And I can see this one goes out here, it goes in here, this goes out of the I and it goes into the R. So the kind of double checking is, it's kind of easy to check your work. The trick is now what do you do with this set of differential equations that all have to be true at the same time? You can try to find out what happens. So a simple thing to do is set each of these equal to 0 and say, when is it not changing? That would be the change in S equals 0, the change in I equals 0, the change. So is there a stable equilibrium? where it doesn't change. And you can do the algebra to solve for that. You can also R naught, the basic reproductive number comes out of this as a relationship between these transition probabilities. And then you can solve the equation to get what R naught means. And then you change the model a little bit, see what R naught is in the new model, and so on. But we don't know beta and we don't know gamma, so we know mathematically what R naught is, but we can't just figure out what the number is. So I often try to observe it in the data, like in a new area when cases first start, how many new ones are there in a certain period of time. And then that lets us start to figure out what beta and gamma are. So the parameters are biologically meaningful, but statistically hard to estimate. It's the kind of observed data we have. And this is the usual epidemic curve model. You start with everyone susceptible, they start to get infected, and then the infecteds become recovered, and pretty soon, in this case, all of the susceptibles got infected by the end. And then all the infecteds became recovered and went back up to 100%. So what we work with when you're doing research with these kind of models are how can you change the structure? You have these biologically meaningful parameters, and then what kind of observed data do we compare it to? And usually it's some kind of surveillance system that's reporting the number of new infections per month or per week or something like that. And you link the math to the observations to try to figure out what beta and gamma are and what R naught is. You might do that with the flu every fall. The challenge is if you don't have the right data, these biologically meaningful parameters are really hard to identify statistically. And I gave the example of, how do you tell the difference between a new disease where you've got a lot of contacts and a low probability of transmission, or one with a few contacts and a high probability of transmission? They can generate the same number of cases in a given week. Now, if I have extra information on the number of contacts, then I can start to tell those apart. So one of the games in some of these models, like if you introduce a vaccine into the system, is trying to figure out what extra information would help me tell these things apart. So there's lots of applications and extensions of the SIR model. You're familiar with this. There's like SIS that recovers or susceptible immediately again. So there's only two states you bounce between, and we'll see a version of that. Ones where you become infected or you're exposed for a while before you become infectious. And then, like in the case of COVID, you're infectious before you know. You're infectious before you have symptoms, which is sort of an insidious thing here. You can't say, oh, stay home when you feel sick, because you're already infecting people beforehand. So you could play with those kind of parameters to see how the difference works out. So you can say, well, what if there's change over time in these transmission parameters? What if there's changes in space or space and time? You can have competition between strains of disease like we do in dengue. But basically it comes down to what are your assumptions? What are the rules? What story are you trying to tell? And what happens if you change things? Okay, so it sounds like there's a lot we could do with COVID, we could do with flu, we could do with dengue. So why use the imaginary diseases? And part of that is because I think you can make it a little simpler than the real world. So with imaginary diseases, you're going to do the same thing. What's the story? What are you trying to model? What are the assumptions? What are the rules? What do you know? Like this rule has to hold, and which one do I think? Like, do the vampires have to eat? How often do they have to eat? What happens if they don't eat them? And then what happens if you change things? So you can change the rules, but there's still rules behind it. I mean, to me, that's what's interesting about science fiction or something, or a fantasy book. There's rules, they're different from our rules, but part of the story is sort of revealing how this plays out, right? So, and then what are the consequences of those rules, and what changes the rules, and what could you observe to figure out what the rules are? So, zombies, what's the story? It's not a rhetorical question. Yeah.
You get zombies can infect other people, and
okay.
People become zombies, and go on to infect others.
Okay, so there's a transmission, and if attacked by a zombie, you become a zombie. What else do we know?
You don't recover.
You don't recover. Okay, so we can think of a model where there's an endpoint, they're not going to move back to susceptible. What if you died of another cause? Can you become a zombie? Interesting question, right? Let's see if that plays out. Okay, what are qualities of the zombie we might want to discuss? Yeah,
Well, I guess in some types of zombies, you have like an exposed period where, maybe the person has been bitten and they don't know yet.
okay,
But,
good. So we might have an we might have an E period. Could they be cured? Maybe in that period, but not after? Yeah, no, I mean, that's a good question. Did you have one?
Yeah, the zombies can be like killed.
Yeah, so that's a good, in what way?
If there's a zombie hunter.
Okay.
Yeah.
What does a zombie hunter do to kill a zombie?
Watch some more horror movies and me decapitate them, right?
Yeah, I think if the head gets removed, yeah, the head, yeah, okay. And sort of, yeah,
If a person's bitten by a zombie dog, do they become a zombie?
yeah, so is it a zoonotic, zombinotic, zombie with Z-O-O in the beginning? Yeah, that's a good question. So you have other species. There's also the characteristics of the zombie. Do they slow down ever? Are they just constantly moving? Are they fast? Are they slow? Is there a range of them? Do they ever rest? If they lose their legs, do they crawl, continue to crawl after you? So part of the scary part of the movie is they never rest, right? It's a constant thing. And then if they're fast, that also adds a sense of fear. But that exposed period, I think, has been played for a lot of emotional drama. You've got a, relationship to resolve. Yeah.
Do they evolve?
Do they evolve? Yeah, that's a good question. Or are is it just zombies have always been the same? So we have lots of questions we might want to answer. We might think about what we could answer. So the book chapter that started this is this paper by Munns et al. The senior author, Robert Smith with the question mark, actually changed his name to add the question mark, so he would not get confused with the singer from The Cure. It's the way the story goes. But he's also made kind of a cottage industry. So many people did their own versions of the zombie models that he's collected papers. He has a edited book on mathematical modeling. And then people did like research about zombie culture that weren't so much new math models, but also about zombies. So he has one called Brains, and it's Academics to Zombies, or A to Z, and it's a lot of chapters about just everyone from their own field talking about zombies. So he also wrote the book on the left, The Modeling Disease Ecology with Mathematics, is a nice introduction to the math of the modeling. It doesn't really get into why you're modeling, but that's one of the best discussions of estimating R naught from the system that I like. And then mathematical modeling of zombies in the Brains book. So I've read every chapter in both of those. Not that I'm a huge zombie movie fan, but the math is interesting. I mean, that says a lot about me as well. So we talked about our zombie assumptions and some questions. This was our original model. Instead of SIR, it says ZR. And you have the S's go into the Z's, beta S times Z. So there's not density dependent, but it's random mixing. And then the Z goes to the R. The zombies go into recovered or removed. You can also go directly from S to R. You could die of another cause. What other things are in the model that are different from the SIR model? Yeah.
The R can go back to Z.
Yeah, the R can go back to Z. So that means you could die of another reason and still be brought back as a zombie. I'm not sure I go for that. This is a problem. This zeta parameter here is a problem because under no circumstances can the humans win in this game, because if you died of something else, you would eventually be brought back. If we waited long enough, there's a small probability, but it's not zero. Yeah.
But what if you could like do an intervention where, like maybe a zombie cannot recover if it's been decapitated, so you just start burying your dead without their heads?
It's not in the model. So how would we change that in the model? Yeah,
Well, we could have a cultural adaptation where everyone cremates their dead instead of.
okay, right. So what would that do to the model?
So if everyone was cremated
Okay.
very quickly,
That's fine.
then you would remove the parameter where dead people could revert.
Okay,
back
so
to
we would convert zeta to zero.
Yeah, it would become zero through human cultural
Okay,
adaptation.
so then it's changed the dynamics of the system in a way that we hope would allow some chance of survival. Yeah, but it stops this loop of everything ends in Z. That's well done. That used to be the final project, and those are the best projects to read. They would start with like, if you're reading this, I'm dead. No, you're not. Oh yeah, pi, what's pi there? What's the? Yeah, there's new susceptibles coming in some way. They're either being born, it's gonna be a birth rate, or they may be immigrating into the zombie infested area, so. So there's their basic model. They use the prime notation, but it's still a change in S over R. Got pi coming in, the beta S, you can see how it pairs up. If you leave S, you go to Z, or you go to S. So there, everywhere there's a minus, there needs to be a plus. And then there's ending up in the zombie, which is the problem. And so one equilibrium of this is there's no zombies to start with. So it's not an interesting equilibrium, and it's not stable. If you add one zombie to this, it doesn't stay there. So there can be stable equilibrium and unstable equilibrium in a dynamic system. This is sort of an interesting way to think about it. So then they said, what if there's an infection period? Because now we had a time where people could be maybe cured before they become a zombie. What can you do with the lag period? Could you attack? This is always the big problem in the movie, is I know they're infected, they're going to be a zombie, there's no cure. Should I end them before they're a zombie? So this adds a lot of dramatic tension to the model, which maybe is underappreciated when we talk about real diseases, but still, there's it still has the zeta R going back. So there's still a path where you're ultimately going to be a zombie. There's no way humans can win. This was the disappointing part of the chapter that a lot of people just couldn't live with. So to speak. So it's a more complicated model, but you're trying to find parameters where humanity has a chance. And these new components were, well, we've already talked about beta. We talked about the delta of S of dying of a different reason. And there's the susceptibles drops to 0. Now, how can we change it? And we've already talked about the zeta R, going back to the zombie state, that's the weak link in the ZR model. So past class projects, some people had competition and spillover as zombie raccoons were introduced into one model, and that absorbed enough infection that humans had a chance. Is there a more effective human defense? Do zombies that wear out was also a hypothesis that maybe, at the beginning of the epidemic, we don't know. It looks like they never wear out, but they could. And we could add a cure by maybe having a certain number of the zombies that are cured. And maybe they could go back to susceptible, or maybe they're now immune. In this case, they're immune. And there we can get the traditional epidemic curve, and the human population drops, but it doesn't drop all the way to 0. There's also space-time versions of this, and moving zombies and fast zombies, and human holdouts. And this is an animated zombie apocalypse that generates data in air quotes. Comments?
Can I see the figure with the cure ones?
Yeah. Yeah, the 4th was the number cured. Okay, so there's lots that you can still talk about. There's more things you can do with zombies, the fast and the slow, the space, the time we got. So another imaginary disease happened in World of Warcraft. And I'll tell you about what happened, how, and their behavioral response in players. This was before the COVID pandemic by quite a bit. So in 2004, there was a patch that introduced a new quest for participants. They had access for these high-level characters that would go after this. Hakar, players ran the risk of being infected by a curse called corrupted blood, and high-level characters could transport to other locations, and so they did after they were infected. And it had an incredibly high transmission rate and mortality rate, and characters started dying left and right across this whole virtual world. The participants in the virtual world are messaging each other all about this in a panic. Those that have healing spells, some of them are rushing, being first responders. And this game-wide epidemic spun out of control. They actually reset the servers finally, because So what happened was players with pets could infect their pets, but the code didn't ever let the pets recover, so they stayed infectious after the owner died, and they would wander around. Same with non-player characters, if they were infected, would stay infected, interact with other players and start infecting them. So there was, and players that had pets there's a high penalty if your pet dies. So they would dismiss their pets instead and send this infected pet off into the world. Now it's free to infect others. And so there were problems where they set up a model inside the system, but they didn't cover all the bases. And then there's a literature of people studying how people behaved, how players behaved. So one thing is altruism, and someone wrote about, they went to help each other, and that did happen. There's also glitching, people trying to work the system, work outside the system. And then not grieving, but griefing, that's where they would get infected and then go intentionally infect other players. Or say, everything's fine here, and people would rush there to quarantine and then find out they weren't. So there were trolls involved. Not the World of Warcraft trolls, but the internet type troll. So a glitching example is the Kobayashi Maru story in Star Trek. So are you familiar with that? So does anybody know the Kobayashi Maru? Okay, so I'm really old. So Captain Kirk, one thing that made him a really good captain is they had to pass a captaining simulation at Starfleet Academy where they were supposed to help a ship called the Kobayashi Maru, but they programmed it so there's no way to win. They wanted to see what you would do in an unwinnable situation. So no matter what you tried, you would lose. So Kirk, the night before his, reprogrammed the code so there was a way for him to win. And this wasn't really an episode in the old story. It was just like, oh, no one else has passed the Kobayashi Maru. So his question is, did he cheat or not? Was that part of the game? Where's the game end in the test? Anyway. I have a model of Kobayashi Maru in my office because when I was department chair, it sort of felt like that. You can't believe that I don't believe in the no winnable situation. And then Dungeons and Dragons was coming back, and they said if you're going to be in your basement pretend to be an elf, at least have some friends come over. So they were trying to build off of the World of Warcraft disaster. Any thoughts on that? Or before we get to vampires, it's just sort of an interesting thing that happened. So it was an imaginary disease with a model involved, and people interacted with the model. There was some literature before COVID saying this might tell us how people would behave in a pandemic. And then it's sort of like, yeah, there's some people who are jerks. So there's a lot of people really want to help. And it's some of the things we can see. Yeah.
Was there any reason why the World of Warcraft outbreak was picked over real outbreaks to guess how people would behave in a pandemic?
Oh, yeah, no, it's a good point. So how's this different from the world? There's lots of preparedness training. Cities and governments had gone through this with simulated things. So there are real life simulations of how do you get together and what kind of decisions do you make, what kind of networks. So I think some of the World of Warcraft literature outside of the standard preparedness literature was looking at how do people who aren't there, you're going to be here and we're going to start a pandemic, so you need to figure it out. So that kind of sets some it's sort of like the Kobayashi Maru, right? They know they're in a world where they need to solve this problem, or as opposed to a world where you're going about your business and something happens and then you're only interacting by what you hear. So I think some of that's a little bit different, but I think those exercises for governments are really important, but they tend to get lost when they're, the lessons learned. There's a million preparedness plans that sat on shelves because you had to decide something fast. We didn't know what was going on. You had a million people telling a governor or a health commissioner, my cousin can build an app to track where, So there were a lot of people proposing solutions, and most of them I think were, in good intentions. But there wasn't a hold on. We have a 500-page plan. Let's go ahead and pull that out and see. So I think it's really an interesting kind of social view of this. I have a book about the Ebola outbreak in Liberia in 2014, and it's called something like Outbreak. It's some things you see. Like when you're planning, you're saying, we're gonna do the best thing for most of the people, and when it's really happening, a lot of people are like, what's best for me and my family? And you can see some of those changes, so yeah, I think that's a really good question. Yeah,
Just like, what was the, like, outcome of the corrupted blood thing? Was it just like everyone in the server kept getting infected, and like they couldn't, you couldn't end the cycle because there were the pets and like the NPCs?
yeah, so they had to reboot the whole system, I think, I mean, that's what I read about. And so I think by rebooting it, there's no residual piece to it, but they couldn't figure out a way to let that world run. Cause all the people who are losing their characters are paying subscribers to this too, so. There was a big push to stop it as soon as possible, instead of saying, hey, it's just what happens, like a big dragon got loose, what are you gonna do? It just went way faster than they expected. Yeah.
Yeah, I just had also a quick question about that, like what, in the papers that people have written about it, what data is actually available? Like, is there?
Oh,
Case
yeah,
notes,
no, it's
like-
interesting. One of the things I found on this Google Scholar round is like Stanford's library has a whole bunch of websites they archived of news reports about it from the gaming community and news surf. They have videos of people playing, but they said they had 4 videos that weren't really, they said they weren't really informative because it's basically a character walking through an area with just bones everywhere.
Excellent.
So I think there's some like backtracking things you could do. They use Wayback Machine and they look how the blogs evolved and message boards evolved over this. So I think there's some pieces that I didn't dig too deep in the kind of behavioral research of how people interact, because a lot of it'll take, here's the corrupted blood incident, and then here's how people behave on some other kind of virtual world interaction. So the scholars who work in that kind of digital area, and I don't mean to, I'm not diminishing that work, but they see it as a peculiar example of player-to-player interaction in a virtual world too, so I think that's possible. Did you have a question too? Okay. So let's spend a little time on vampires. So how are they similar to zombies and how are they different? Yeah,
Usually, if you're bitten by a vampire, you also become a vampire.
right, and that we'll actually see some different models where how easily that happens or not. In a lot of vampire stories, it's not so much the vampire creates a horde of vampires. I'm just plugging one thing in here. With the zombies, that it's very transmissible and irreversible. With vampires, it seems a little more selective, but that's something we can discuss. Yeah.
A lot of the Sims.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, a vampire biting someone could have like multiple outcomes, so like, maybe they're just feeding, maybe they're gonna.
Right.
turn into a vampire, or like, maybe they're gonna create like a thrall that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's variations of the infection. There's also like the vampires have a personality. So they actually maintain some kind of personality and different literature will play into that more
So are you
attractive.
saying
Right?
that there's a lot more like populational heterogeneity in like behavior of the vampires and feeding behavior?
Yeah, I would think so. I mean, zombies seem like it's mostly numbers.
Yeah.
So an agent-based model of zombies is just really keeping track of hordes behaving exactly the same, whereas if you've read the Anne Rice zombie books, they have different motivations for being zombies or being vampires and different interactions, different time periods.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say, I feel like you would need like a, because I think also, like whether or not a vampire is feeding or turning someone into a vampire, for both of those things, it seems like their ideal target varies by age, so like an age structured, it could be like a matrix model. Might be my most suitable.
Yeah, so the age structure of your victim, the age scale for your victim, the age scale of the vampires wildly different.
Yeah.
So that, or the age they become a vampire, do they stay that age forever or do they age? There's some question of that.
Debate about that in the literature.
Yeah, there's some debate in the literature. And I always feel like that since the vampires have heterogeneous personalities, there's more focus on individual vampires and the impact that they might have. So, yeah.
Also the spread, like I guess the transmission rate would be different for zombies, like it can spread across continents much faster as they,
Right,
as they can only walk in there.
right, yeah, well, there's, or can they? They glitter, yeah, no, that's, yeah, so there, this book, or this applied math paper was trying to seek different models of vampire-human coexistence. And so one of our predator-prey mathematical models is the Lotka-Volterra equation, so this is an old paired. And this is the classic example, so it's from Wikipedia, which means it's the classic example, but it's lynx and rabbits. So if you get a lot of rabbits, the lynx population explodes, and they eat all the rabbits, and the rabbits die out, and the lynx starve, and you get this sort of coupled oscillation of the two populations. So that might be a place to start if humans are prey for vampires. But this paper compared three options. Now they spent a lot of time on this, right? So basically three models. The Stoker-King model is Bram Stoker's original Dracula, which it's October. You should all be reading that. It's written as a series of letters. Interesting. And then Stephen King's Salem Lot. I haven't read that, but those vampires need to feed every night. They feed 4 or 5 consecutive days, then the victim dies and becomes a vampire. So this is sort of a zombie type vampire, right? They're driven by need to feed. There's no organized vampire hunters, and their initial condition was 1 vampire and 650 million people, and then they ran them on. And it was a kind of a Lotka-Volterra, except it's a very unbalanced population. The second one is the Anne Rice model. This is the series of Interview with the Vampire, Vampire Lasat, Queen Damned, and so here vampires don't need to feed every day or night, as the case may be. They sometimes kill the victims, but even the ones they kill don't always turn into vampires. They need to permit. It's an evolved, like, I think they take all the blood out of them, and then they have to bite them and drink all the blood.
It's a process to it.
Yeah. So it's not an easy thing. They started with 2 vampires and 982 million people. And then again, no organized vampire hunters. Now there are vampire hunters in Dracula, but it's Van Helsing. It's just one person chasing. So I thought on a global scale, that wasn't. And then the last one is, there's actually more authors. This is Stephanie Meyer's Twilight ones who don't have to feed only at night. They can feed on animal blood. But then there's also the True Blood series, which is also around the 2000s. This is a TV series where the vampires and humans coexist, and vampire blood's sought after as a hallucinogenic drug for humans. So now we're consuming their blood too. That means there are organized vampire hunters, drainers, that try to do that, and there's synthetic blood, so the vampires don't have to kill people. So then it's all about the interpersonal connection between them. So their initial condition was there are 5 million vampires because they're coexisting and 6 billion people. So this is around 2001, and they're all organized. So the Stoker-King has initial numbers of humans and vampires. Humans become vampires. I don't think the vampires become human. Picture leads to equations, and it's unstable. It's slow, well, and not really that slow. Since they're feeding every 5 days and turning them into a vampire, it turns everybody into vampires. So they say this can't possibly be real because this doesn't match our. The Anne Rice one, vampires convert to humans at a very different rate, and that humans, I need to their notation for their figures is a little different. Humans, this is giving birth to new humans. That's what's going on here. There's a reproduction rate in humans. Vampires don't reproduce; they just convert humans. You get equations, and this vampires still win. They don't win as decisively as they do in the other one, because the first one was really more of a zombie kind of model. They just took it. And then the Harris-Meyer-Kostova model is more complicated because you can remove vampires. And again, just like with our having the removal of zombies, this led to peaceful coexistence. They got a stable equilibrium, but that's because they gave them another food source, and the conversion was not seen as just part of survival. There was also mathematical modeling of like various. Where you should use mirrors or silver bullets or what works best. They built an agent-based model of people interacting with different weapons, and they observed the emergent behaviors. They talked about instinct versus reason. And it was a marketing journal, so without marketing, it would stakes worked really well, but with marketing, you actually add in some of the other effectiveness, and people can say how well they work on it. So there's a rich vampire lore, including marketing. The Pharaoh's Curse is a new one I read more this year. And this is more of a actual and ecological model or hypothesis. So this was the sealed entrance to King Tut's tomb. It still had the clay seal on it. So that was a cool black and white striking image. And this is Harold Carter and workers going into King Tut's tomb, and that's a Far Side cartoon. Let's see, you. So Lord Cardigan funded Howard Carter's expedition to find King Tut's tomb. He went to visit the tomb after it was found, and he died mysteriously, not immediately after, but like 4 months later. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the Sherlock Holmes, weighed in, but he was kind of into seances and stuff by this time, and so I don't know. He thought it was, and so anyway, the disease ecology question: could you have a long-lived, highly virulent pathogen that survived outside a living host for thousands of years and then infect? So could this curse be a fungal disease or a prion or something like that that can last a long time without a living host? And the literature is mixed on this. So there's a modeling one in 1996 saying maybe you could, and then someone wrote to Lancet, the medical people. They said, no, absolutely not. And then someone said, well, maybe, and they wrote a year later.
Is that the accent of people who
Yeah,
published it?
Yeah. That's from someone who's, every time someone goes, our Lancet paper, they say Lance, and I like perk up, and then I get into the T and I go, oh. As Lancet says, I said, no, absolutely not. And then there's some, how can we use models to think about this? And one of them used some models to say it's probably unlikely, but they have assumptions 1 to 10. Pretty detailed description of what they're assuming, what they're not assuming about a pathogen and how it's transmittable. But interesting read and so on. And then the last one I just found this year, I'd really like to read, but haven't read yet, but it's a spatial version of this. And you start thinking about, like, so aspergillosis, another sort of soil-bound fungus infections, prion disease, chronic wasting disease can survive in the environment. So, you start thinking about, okay, well, when does it cross the line and become the Pharaoh's curse? Does it have to be 1,000 years? Or so there's some interesting modeling papers that I would like to read and think we could discuss sometime about environmental infections. And how do you tell if it's like direct contact, kind of what pattern results from that, and indirect transmission patterns. So I think there's some interesting modeling branches you could go on from that. And then I put this paper in on modeling and practice on controlling academic spread by social distancing. Do it well or not at all. So this was published in 2013. And basically said, if you're gonna do social distancing, make sure everyone socially distances. I have the abstract in there, but we don't have to talk about it. And then I used a Bigfoot data set, a book chapter on disease mapping, and this is what the referee wrote. This leads directly to the appropriateness of the Bigfoot. We said Sasquatch, by the way. The whimsical is appealing. It's not clear it's a good illustrative example, but we stuck to our guns and kept it in there. And one thing we found, we looked at Washington State and Oregon, because that's where Bigfoot lives, right? And Skamania County, Washington had like a 70% increase in number of reports. Wow, it's really weird. And I've taught it in a short course, and someone from the University of Washington goes, well, you know why? And it's because on April Fool's Day in 1986, there was a county ordinance saying, whereas this creature is generally and commonly known as Sasquatch or the giant hairy ape, if any premeditated, willful, or wanton slaying of such creatures shall be deemed a felony punishable by a fine not to exceed $10,000 or imprisonment not to exceed 5 years. That was in Skamania County. So I think the data set was looking at news reports about Bigfoot, and there were a bunch of news reports about this. And there was another county ordinance years later, not on April Fool's Day, so on real time, saying, well, if it needs to have an autopsy, and if we decide it's an anthropoid, then it's a felony. If it's not, then it's a misdemeanor. So they spent good quality county council time clarifying this. Because there'd probably been some discussion and maybe some public comment. And so on. Anyway, I'm collecting a bibliography of these. I think it'll be kind of a fun collection, or I'm having a lot of fun with it, you know, I'm in the twilight of my career, I might as well have fun with this sort of stuff. But part of it is, you can do things like this and. Thanks a lot. Yeah, you can. Are you mansplaining this thing?
Oh, yeah.
So I find this interesting. I think it's a way to think through in maybe a less, so people might ask questions about a zombie model they wouldn't ask about a dengue model. Like, what if the mosquitoes, oh no, these are day feeders. And then everyone in the audience goes, yeah, they are. So like the question never gets answered, like what would happen? Now, if it was the vampires, you said, what if they're day feeders? If people would say, well, it's only in twilight, and go, oh, well, then what would be the difference? And then what kind of data would we want to collect to try to tell the difference between those? Those are some of the questions I think would be interesting. So I think this would be a fun book to write. I talked to a publisher about it, and he goes, it doesn't sound all that organized. So I've got some work to do. If you have suggestions, feel free to say. I don't know, this might be something I do after I retire, you know. I don't actually watch a lot of horror movies either, but you know, I like the stories. I don't necessarily want, I mean, I do like Frankenstein's my favorite novel. I do like reading that. And I read Dracula again last year, and it holds up okay. So both Frankenstein and Dracula start with the letter writing, like you're reading correspondence, but then Frankenstein takes off without it. And it's not a big scary monster book. It's more like, what does it mean to be human? So
That's scary in a different way.
it is scary, but I think Mary Shelley's, it was just a brilliant story. Like, it doesn't go into too much detail that would date it. And it's got a lot of questions of, you know, what are your responsibilities with what you've created? What does it mean? Am I a monster or am I not? So anyway, I hope you find this fun. I think this is a thing. I like doing this every October. And I'm starting to get pieces together of like, how does this help you understand the whole modeling process a little better? I feel like I was a little more coherent this year than it was last year. And, you know, I'd be interested in thoughts you'd have, even if it occurs to you 6 months from now, you're like, oh, I was thinking maybe the Loch Ness monster should be in here. What if it had a pathogen? So anyway, thanks for, yeah, there's lots